I think we're gonna go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm Becca Cooley. I'm a law student here at Berkeley. I did want to take a quick moment to thank the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies for helping host and organize this event, and a special shout out to Carlos Gutierrez and Julia Bird, and also Gregory Loudon for all your help in making this event happen. And I am so excited to introduce you all to Gabriel Perez. Gabriel is an incredible Nicaraguan educator, artist, and community organizer. And he is also a very dear comrade of mine. We met when I was living in Managua back in 2016, and he was running the Casa Cultural Larisoma, which was one of the very few and arguably the only cultural, artistic, and organizing space geared towards young queer people in Managua. Like the name La Soma suggests, the space and Gabriel himself really served as this essential horizontal root system across the city, fostering the growth and spread of ideas and community. But in 2018, the Nicaraguan government sought to uproot and dismantle this root system and basically any other form of civic engagement that did not involve blind support of the Ortega regime. But this did not stop Gabriel. He went on and got his master's at the Institute of Critical Studies in Mexico City, and he continues to write and organize and educate and make art from Merida, Mexico, where he is currently exiled. I don't want to take up any more time. I know that Gabrielle has put together a really excellent presentation, and we also want to make sure we have plenty of time at the end for you all to ask any questions. So I will hand things off to Gabrielle.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Becca, and thank you so much, everybody that helped organize these kind of spaces. I'm really, really happy to be here and share with you all research that I've been doing for the last 5 years through my master's program, and most recently from here in Mexico. So I will be sharing a presentation, and I want to basically do an overview of the history of contemporary art in Nicaragua. This is going to be kind of like greatest hits, and it might go really fast. I just really want to invest in the Q&A so I can really talk about the specific things that you might be interested in. So I was trying to think of a metaphor for this. So as an artist, imagine I am a abstract painter. You, the audience, are a canvas, and history is paint. I am going to rapidly throw paint onto canvas, hoping that something makes sense out of it. So let's start. So a lot of my motivation as a researcher and artist is I want to write and investigate the scene that I'm a part of. So through a long process, I've asked my close friends and artists what kind of research they wanted to see in the world, which led to a gap in the content in the history of contemporary art in Nicaragua. But at the same time, I was very much inspired by unionization movements in the U.S., critical readings in critical art administration through my master's program. And also, I need to honor my family, who my mom and dad are both historians and organizers. So it kind of like just runs in the family. One of the big things why I think is important to write about art history or art history in Nicaragua is because at the end of the day, we're talking about social agency. The vibrancy of an art scene reflects certain liberties of artists and agents to experiment. So by seeing the limitations onto the art scene, we can kind of analyze what is aesthetically and politically permissible within capitalism. So what's interesting for me is kind of seeing the limitations, because I see art as this space, this experiment this process that allows us to think of alternatives, imagine escape routes, and also challenge historical narratives, but mostly think about the current today and the now. So there's very different ways to do this. And there's very different ways to do an art history. On one side, there's a canonical art history that is concerned with increasing market value of certain artists or certain art pieces. It's interested in creating canons and grand narratives and produce art movements. It celebrates biography only if you can paint this motivational art from the artist that came from nothing and now is selling for millions, and kind of celebrates the art world, and kind of tends to depoliticize a lot of the art institutional framework. And then there's a critical art history that is intentionally writing about art as a way to critique the art world's complicity with capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism. Is interested in visibilizing oppression within institutions, within the art world. It has a materialist approach, it has a feminist approach, it has a decolonial approach. And is overall just very suspicious of these grand narratives that are perpetuated in the art market and in art institutions. So two examples of that, in focused on Central America is on one side we have this book, Central American Modernism, written by a Miami millionaire entrepreneur called Mark Morgenford, who has a private collection of art and owns million-dollar properties in Panama and in Nicaragua, and basically wrote a book, in my opinion, as a way to elevate the value of a collection that he already owned. So there's obvious conflict of interests there. And this book is trying to canonize certain art, certain artists, and certain artworks. And on the other side, we have a more radical approach, which is this was just published last year, which basically approaches art as this opportunity to confront power and to critique colonialism and to critique imperialism and to basically celebrate resistance from the grassroots level. So here are two different ways of approaching an art history in Nicaragua and in Central America. Nevertheless, I still think that in Cornejo's example, she leaves out the institutional context of the art scene and doesn't really engage with the circuit of Central American art that, in my opinion, precedes artistic creation. So my main approach as a researcher for this topic has been to use institutional critique as a method. Basically, institutional critique, if you are a social researcher or an artist, you might know it as this kind of like art movement of artists that were critiquing the art institution from within the art world. It's over 40 years old. It has its own canons. And basically, I grab that body of work and I extract very different concepts such as audience and critique, obviously, and what is institutions and what is art for. And I grab all that and I decide that my main strategy for analyzing art in Nicaragua is going to be to consult how art and cultural institutions have reacted to political events, as a way to reveal the art institutions' internal ideology, social anxieties, and logics. So basically, I've reviewed over 40 years of artist expression and cases of censorship or polemical kind of like events, and see how institutions, cultural institutions, position themselves in face of those events as a way to protect a certain ideology or politics at the moment. Because as I said before, I think that institutional context of a scene defines what kind of artistic creation can actually occur within that scene. And then, of course, we encounter more material limitations into how to do an art history from Nicaragua with Nicaragua. So some obvious limitations that Becca might be very aware of too, since she did research in Nicaragua, is unstable or underfunded academic institutions. Art history is not a priority in the humanities. People study art as a creative device in order to complement graphic design, marketing, and tourism or publicity. Um, and then for the specific case of Nicaragua, I think Nicaragua is known for its literature and its poetry, and there's certain institutional secrets that support that, and and that's not really the same for Nicaraguan art. And other kind of material challenges are news reports are lost or were deleted, texts are misplaced, unorganized, difficult to find. A lot of the history runs through gossip or word of mouth or unpublished work. There's no centralized public archive like a art library that you could consult. A lot of academic research on Nicaragua circulates privately, in my opinion, in United States institutions as well. And there's very limited research on what happens outside of the major cities. And then most recently, due to the political situation in Nicaragua, a lot of participants don't want to be interviewed because they don't want to say something that might be put them in the radar or might even go against the art world. So talking about art institutions, I want to highlight the two most important art institutions in Nicaragua. Not really in Nicaragua. The first one, Teoretica, is one of the most important institutions that dedicate to the research of art and are the ones that have supported Nicaraguan art the most in terms of research and publication and critical research, I mean. And they're based in Costa Rica. So I think the most important kind of research institution is not even in Nicaragua. And then at the other side, the Institute of History is awesome, but it was confiscated by the government as recent as 2023. And all those archives and materials are completely lost for researchers to actually go there and try to make a history out of it. Which leads me to this very clear realization that or very obvious realization that all critical research in Nicaragua is conducted amidst a mass censorship project that has resulted in over 30 universities closed down and 5,000 nonprofits closed down. So this adds a dimension of responsible research and ethical research when you're doing research about Nicaragua. This is the base ground that will politicize any research that's tried to be, any critical research that has to happen about Nicaragua. You're just confronted with this political reality. So what I've decided to do is to briefly go over these very different moments in the history of contemporary art. And you might immediately notice that the history of contemporary art in Nicaragua is the history of Nicaragua. It's like the history of political changes in Nicaragua. Because then remember, what I'm trying to do is connect the political material reality of what Nicaragua is going through and how that influenced art production. So we start from the revolution and then end up to last year. So I will go over each of these different moments and talk about the main tensions, institutional tensions that were occurring in that specific period. Starting hot with the revolution, the main question that was happening in the revolution in the art scene is, what does revolutionary cultural policy look like? And because the revolution was seen as this process and event that was full of potential, art was to be seen as actual democracy or as a human right or as a way to celebrate local knowledge. So the revolution has been historically celebrated for really investing in art, popular art, literature, movies, and just an entire art scene at the local level. But then again, we get a tension between two of the most important figures. On one side, Ernesto Cardenal, who was leading the Ministry of Culture, and Rosario Murillo, who was leading the Association of Sandinista Cultural Workers, because they both had different definitions of what cultural policy should do. Cardenal thought that art should be something that the people use to make sense of their reality, and it should engage dialogue and should empower people to process their everyday life, and that art should be accessible to all. Whereas Rosario Murillo thought that art should be somewhat reserved to the cultured, educated urban artists, and that art should have international merits, and it should really showcase how good art has become during the revolution. So very two different approaches. And unfortunately, that debate came to a close due to the civil war, the Contra War, the US sponsored war on Nicaragua. It just completely interrupted any kind of like formal artistic process there. Moving on to the 90s, in the middle of all those exciting conversations about what art should do, there's a drastic change in government, and the new government led by Violeta Chamorros enters with the United States support and to install neoliberalism. So art during this period is seen as a tool for reconciliation. Basically, art shouldn't be political. Art shouldn't divide families that are still processing wars. Art needs to be done in the name of peace. Whatever political art is done is seen as too polarized. While at the same time, art is the tool for economic growth. So we are going to deploy a neoliberal framework for art and culture as a way to encourage artists to become entrepreneurs and to sell their work and to start galleries as a way to get out of poverty. So the definition of art drastically heads in that direction, and any kind of political art will be censored. And this culminated in and this is the hottest kind of like event polemic that happened during this period in the early 90s. It culminated in hundreds of revolutionary murals being destroyed by the government, being destroyed by the mayor's office, in this case in Managua, that all these fabulous archive of revolutionary murals that celebrated women's rights, celebrated the success of the revolution, celebrated people power, were then all completely disappeared in the entire scene, kind of paving the way that public space is not for art, it's for commerce. Art needs to relegate to a economic sphere, and it shouldn't try to do social justice, was basically the name of the game during this period. At the same time, moving through the 90s, we finally get the birth of contemporary art in Nicaragua, very, very late in the 90s. There's a slow experimental young art scene happening. There's more dialogue between artists, and there's curatorial effort coming from Costa Rica. And there's like interesting things happening there. So there's two scenes. There's a younger, experimental, playful scene, and then at the other side, there's a older, more conservative, kind of like canonized masters of Nicaraguan painting scenes. And these two scenes would come into confrontation at the Bienal. The Bienal was, of course, the invention of our local culture patrons, the Ortiz Gurdian Foundation family. They made their wealth through being bankers and through really using neoliberalism to enrich themselves. They started banks, but they invested in art and invested in culture. So a lot of the art infrastructure exists because of them. They were able to plug Nicaraguan art to international markets and really take advantage of the lack of infrastructure that existed. So they proposed to do the Nicaraguan biennials that were seen as like the most important contest for Nicaraguan art. And of course, they name everything after themselves. I think the running joke is that here's the joke: the Ortiz Gurdian family unveiled the Ortiz Gurdian statue at the Ortiz Gurdian Biennial, presented in the Ortiz Gurdian Art Center. Like literally everything is named after them. And if you live in Nicaragua, you very much are aware of this. And surprisingly, this is the work that wins for a painting biennial. So the winner, Patricia Belli, one of the most important artists in Nicaragua, submits this work, which is multimedia, has some elements of painting, and it wins the second biennial, and it completely disrupts the entire art scene. So the classical masters of art are really, really mad because they all hated the fact that this postmodern art collection of photographs, paintings, and different designs won a contest dedicated to painting. So in my analysis, of course, Patricia Belli deserved to win. This is an amazing piece, and it was about time that the institutions recognized experimental art that was being created. But at the same time, I think that the Ortiz Gurdian family saw an opportunity to really connect to a contemporary art market and really invest in a new upcoming market in Nicaragua, to basically take over this new niche that was being created. So her winning this piece completely validates experimental artwork and inspires a bunch of people at the expense of the old school artists that have been controlling the country for like 30 years. So this is the birth of contemporary art. Her winning this piece completely changes everything. Moving into globalization, we see new sensibilities emerging because of the Ortiz Gurdian. We see mass communication, artists exploring new materials, and of course, internet and social media. And the revolution's getting more and further away from artists' everyday kind of narrative. And we have probably one of the most controversial pieces explored in the history of Nicaraguan art, which is Exposición Número Uno, where this artist, Abacuc, grabbed the street dog and presented it in a Nicaraguan art gallery. And immediately this work went viral, and it inspired this mob of users to comment against the definition of art, against the definition of contemporary art, accusing Abacuc of torturing a dog. And basically, Nicaragua grows really fast and now has to make sense of this newfound power, I would say. Just to clarify, this dog was not killed or harmed. It was grabbed, put it, and then it escaped several days later after it was properly fed and given water. But that's not important. What's important for the new networks, globalized networks of narratives, is that this dog was supposedly killed in the name of art. Moving on to kind of more recent, we see Orteguismo, where Daniel Ortega, the revolutionary president from the 80s, returns to power after 15 years trying to get back into power. And his approach to art was to defend national culture, defend the national heroes, and institutionalize national revolutionary narratives. So he was very pro-art as a way to build history and narratives in favor of the revolutionary government. While at the same time, we have a strong capitalist presence, we have a strong nonprofit presence, and we enter a golden age of cultural production where there's access to finance, there's scholarships, and there's an exciting cultural scene happening in Nicaragua. But on the art side, one sector of the art world is state-sponsored, is only interested in celebrating the national heroes like Rubén Darío, our famous poet, Sandino, and these mestizo nationalist myths like the Virgin Mary and stuff like that. So the entire state-promoted art apparatus is moved towards creating nationalist paraphernalia, and everything that goes against this will be censored. Here's two examples of censored work. One is Auras de Guerra by Ernesto Salmerón, which is a great multimedia conversation about the image of Sandino. He was able to remove a graffiti of Sandino onto a wall and use it as an opportunity to have complicated conversations about the revolution. And then on the other side, we have Sandino Benetton, which is just our national hero dressed in this preppy sweater. Both of these works were censored by their respective institutions because they didn't follow the national line promoted by the government. But most importantly, another work also tied into the Ortiz Gunnar Biennial is this performance by Elila Sinvergüenza, one of our most celebrated performance artists that we all very deeply love. They did this fabulous piece challenging the government aesthetics and challenging these narratives around mestizaje and identity. And this was supposed to open up the biennial as this event, but after direct order from Rosario Murillo, the now co-president, this work was done illegally and could not be a part of the biennial. So that was the first time that the state intervenes in a private biennial to censor an artwork because it didn't follow their government line. Moving on into the most kind of like recent period, after 15 years of the Ortegas being in power and kind of confiscating what it meant to be Nicaraguan, a series of student-led and then popular protests erupted in what we call the civic insurrection in 2018, which generated a new wave of politically committed artwork. A lot of the work was designed to reclaim what it meant to be Nicaraguan. So a lot of celebration of Nicaraguan myths, but done from a politicized anti-government perspective. And this event definitely marks a new period in Nicaraguan history. And art was one of the main ways to articulate this discontent against the government. In this time, I take advantage to critique the nonprofit industrial complex. And a lot of my research is critiquing the kind of scene that they were able to build. And a big point of contention happened where a famous cultural nonprofit made this exhibition in the name of human rights, and then the presidential family, the sons of the presidential family just attended the place, potentially putting in danger a lot of the artists that were part of this exhibit. So there was a huge contradiction between actually supporting human rights and then just performing a diplomatic washed kind of celebration of resistance. So I critique the nonprofit industrial complex for not creating a sustainable art scene and to really not allowing the production of political art. And then all of these just start to grow and grow and grow into the current political crisis that we see now, where over 5,000 nonprofits have been closed, educational centers have been closed. There's a huge immigration of people who, for an art scene, if you suddenly lose, if for a small country like Nicaragua, where you suddenly lose over 800,000 Nicaraguans, that's going to affect not just talent and audience, but entire social systems and institutions down there. So a way to kind of address that has been to invest in tourism and the creative industry and an international art market. But at the same time, we see an intensification of a repressive state. Here's a recent graph explaining how many nonprofits closed. That's the light blue line. And then how much foreign assistance has gone down, starting from 2018 to 2024. So this is the political crisis moment. And without any nonprofit support, because the art scene kind of depended on this finance and the support, there's very limited opportunities to really invest in our art scene. But local artists are still trying their best to revive the golden years of cultural production that happened about 5 to 10 years ago. Similar to what was happening in the 90s by the neoliberal government, the current government is also mass censoring murals and artists in the name of peace. So there's a funny line between a neoliberal government doing the same thing, but now a supposedly left-wing government doing the exact same thing in the name of very similar concepts, either peace and democracy, are basically empty terms that could be used by whoever to destroy art monuments in this case. And then there's these weird events. This might look like a meme, but I swear it's not, where a lot of the cultural strategy, or this should be further research, a lot of like the cultural strategy from the current state could be tied to our relationships with Russia. But I still need to figure that out a little bit more. Here's an example of another canonical art documentary published just last year. It's a 50-minute long documentary that's supposed to explore the art history of Nicaragua. But this one is a state-sponsored documentary. And I watched this entire thing, and there's very clear omissions, and there's very clear creative liberties that the researchers did to paint the entire art scene as very pacified and non-political, into the direction that art exists thanks to our glorious government that has been to invest in the art. So there's very clear omissions of key actors in the history of art in order to produce this sanitized version of art history that's being widely circulated in the scene. And of course, you need the direct congratulation of the now co-president Rosario Murillo, which means all of this entire documentary was supervised by her and made sure that everything is being said, whatever she wants to be said. And to end kind of this chapter before I talk about some examples of resistance is, by the numbers, I want to give you an idea of one particular scene in the art world and how big we're actually talking about. So I analyzed 5 different art fairs sponsored by the Ortiz Gordian Foundation, and I was able to analyze over 570 works and put in different data to see what kind of art was being produced at this important art fair. The majority was oil on canvas or like acrylic on canvas. So traditional art, traditional materials are very much the norm in Nicaragua. Average price, I mean, I don't know if you're an artist in the US, this might seem very low. In my opinion, I think I added so average price is like $1,000, and then it went up in 2023. Average price per work. And then current total value, we're talking about slightly over $100,000, which a single person could purchase the entire art market for less than the cost of a fancy Rolex, for example. Average price, average age of people that participated in these art fairs is 51. But what's really eye-opening, in my opinion, is that artists over the age of 40 controlled 90% of the market in these fairs. And people less than, so like younger people aren't really participating in the art market scene at these art fairs. And again, it just shows how small that scene is, but even more, in a place like Nicaragua, people's last names are also institutions. So I was able to calculate what were the most common last names, and you get the usual suspects of the most important families in Nicaragua, like the Lacayos, the Ortiz, the Chamorros, the Mejias. All of them are very much involved in this art scene. And then in my last thing, I do want to celebrate as things kind of like rapidly look really sad or really dire throughout our entire history. There have been some examples of exciting art and institutions that have emerged. For example, art in Solentinames. Solentinames is a small archipelago inside of Lake Nicaragua, and artists here um, have able to develop their own aesthetic and their own economy and their own autonomous kind of like systems of validation and supporting of art, which has been internationally celebrated. So it's a rural example of cool art that's happening outside of the cities, but also empowered artistic sector that has its own merits, kind of exists and thrives there. In the 90s, a lot of that weird um, side scene that I was talking about, the more experimental scene, also did really cool magazines, which they employed what I call an experimental critique of just not talking about art and poetry and literature, but also writing in direct confrontation against the dominating institutions. So their existence was very much celebrated as a much needed narrative and discourse in the Nicaraguan art scene in the early 90s, in the 90s. There's of course, if you want to study contemporary art in Nicaragua, the place to go was Espira, led by Patricia Belli, the artist that I mentioned about. And the education is here was non-nationalistic and non-commercial. It was very much invested in the body and in perfecting your practice. And you can see me in both of these pictures right now. I was able to attend Espira in early 2016 for a brief period and has been foundational for my entire practice. And most artists that are popular now went through Espira, in my opinion. We also have these amazing experimental collectives that were doing research and performance and interventions, critiquing mestizo, straight, nationalistic narratives against the government, and we're inviting people to think about play and pleasure and fun and critique and art in more transdisciplinary kind of ways. And then lastly, there is one of the most political and beautiful efforts at transforming what a museum could be is this museum of memory against impunity. In this case, a group of families that had lost people during the civic insurrection went through a grieving process and a process of celebrating their loved ones, but also through a process of evidencing crimes that were committed by the government. So this is actual evidence. This thinks as the museum as a place where you could actually confront national narratives and promote a counter narrative to really face and confront state promoted violence during the protests. And this is just a beautiful example of what a museum could be and what we need more of. And in conclusion, I think that a lot of the art in Nicaragua has been conditioned by institutions, and at the same time, artists have tried to find creative ways to challenge those institutions. And it's things have always been intense, but art has always found a way to react and to propose new ways to think about politics and identity and art and culture and history. And it's going to keep doing that. And I'm very happy that art has been used as this tool to invite participation and to creatively question powers that are. And I think it will keep doing that as long as people remain creative and full of hope and try to invest in their art scene outside of institutional parameters. So all that being said, thank you all so much for hearing this train ride. And that is all I wanted to share today. I hope some of that made sense, and I would love to go more into detail or in depth into any topic that you want me to go into, or we can have side conversations outside of this meeting as well. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Gabe. That was awesome. Such a great presentation and sort of whirlwind through Nicaraguan history and art scene. Um, I want to give folks a chance if you have questions to pop them in the chat, but I have a few questions to sort of kick things off. I think my first question is a terribly like general and abstract question, but um, where do you kind of see the art scene going from here, whether in Nicaragua or exiled? In terms of resistance, that most recent example that you gave was the Museo de la Memoria. And for folks on the call who don't know, that installation was held at the Institute of Nicaraguan Central American History, which, as Gabriel mentioned, was confiscated by the government in 2023. So, in this context of oppression, obviously that's not new in Nicaraguan history, but in this sort of continuing repression, do you have either recommendations or even just kind of premonitions on what might be sort of this next phase?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I've thought about this a lot. I think artists that are in the diaspora making art, they really have the opportunity to make like political art confronting the government if they want to. It will put them in the radar. But if they have that freedom outside, I think a lot of them can do it if they want to, as a way to like keep pressure on the government. That's something that I do, for example, and I think a lot of people are finding their own voice or their ways to be political and not like obviously political ways. And I think that's my biggest suggestion is that art doesn't need to be this aesthetically political thing showing people with fists or kind of like making fun of the government or stuff like that. Art can be political in the relationships that it builds with the audience and with research and with history. So the most political art scene is a scene that is proper, intimate, and autonomous and takes care of each other. So if you're afraid to be censored, you're not going to make political work or protest work. If you really want to politicize the scene, you take care of each other and you invest in your own systems of financing and you start your own study group and you make a gallery out of your house or you really support your friends and your audience. I think that is just as political at making protest art. I think it's if we think about how do we create our own institutions, that can be seen as an art form um, itself. So I see the art scene trying to do that now, especially now that there's no nonprofits, there's no money. What do we do next? It's a great opportunity to really build something different without relying on financial support from nonprofits, the state, or the private sector. And we should take that seriously, and we should learn from DIY scenes across Latin America and in the US to see how people have done that and start these international dialogues with artists in the diaspora and local artists. But they shouldn't be thought of separately. We need to build communication between those two so that nobody feels forgotten.
Thank you. That was great. I have a few more questions, but please feel free to throw any questions in the chat. if you have any questions or comments or ideas or things that you want to share with Gabriel or have him sort of reflect on, please don't be shy. Um, so another question that I had, obviously, and we touched on this on our last question, and obviously you covered this extensively, especially at the beginning of your presentation, um, with this sort of denigration of institutional support within Nicaragua. That makes research on Nicaragua really difficult. So could you actually talk about what your own research methods were and are, for this research? And if you can talk a little bit about how being exiled impacts those methods one way or another.
Absolutely. So my approach, slowly discovering how fractured and disorganized and fragmented kind of like the research on local art history was to number one, talk to the community and talk to my friends and doing like one-on-one meetings and figuring out, hey, let's talk about the history of Nicaraguan art and whatever you want to tell me, we do it like that. So definitely focusing on participants that are currently there or that lived through different moments has been key. And I really have so many people to thank for giving me their time and guidance in this entire process. So definitely honoring local knowledge was important. Another strategy was through trying to find research that was already there. And luckily, there's key texts that have helped so much. Texts from Raul Quintanilla, an amazing artist and critic that has been publishing nonstop since the 80s. There's a beautiful book on Patricia Belli that really explores her experience of the art scene in the 90s and in the 2000s. And then the Ortiz Gurdian was able to create a catalog for every biennial for over 20 years that the for over yeah about 20 years that they did the biennials. So putting all those pieces together, you can start to get like the bigger view. But it's basically doing this research from Nicaragua, from outside of Nicaragua. Um, I don't want to say it helped a lot. A lot of it was computer stuff, like really archiving everything. And I was able to put together one of the largest, probably the largest independent archive in Nicaraguan art history that is free for everybody to consult and to read. And just that task of organizing that was really fun. And I still keep finding new texts that I find around the way and I throw it in there. So talking to people and doing my best to find whatever has been published there.
If that's publicly available and you're open to it, you should drop it in the chat, or obviously at the end we can let folks know how they can reach out to you in case they want to take a look at that archive or learn more. I have one last question before we maybe start to wrap up, unless there are some other questions in the chat, which I'm keeping an eye out for. But obviously, I and many others here at Berkeley are here in the United States, and the US, of course, has a very long imperial and neo-imperial history in Nicaragua. Um, so can you talk, and I know you talked about globalization um, a bit, but can you talk a little bit about the role of the US in this critical art history, or like, is there a role? Yeah.
Absolutely. So the US financing the Contra War in the 80s completely interrupted any kind of actual art art framework that could have really benefited people because a lot of the support went to self-defense rather than to investing in art and in artists. So that's one way that the US like materially changed. And there was an embargo in the 80s. I mean, there was a lot of stuff led by Ronald Reagan in the 80s that despite of that, artists still tried their best and did really, really beautiful work that is internationally celebrated. But that's one example of how the US directly affected an art scene was through supporting this war. In the 90s, the US was also literally writing the policy bills that Nicaragua was going to do in neoliberalism. So the pivot towards a free market economy in the 90s was 100% supported by the United States. And the role of culture was also kind of written into these policy bills and created wealth and created um, a scene that there was like no public funding for any artist that wanted to use public funds because everything was privatized. So that influence in the US in the 90s definitely affected the entire art scene. Until today, there's a pivot towards commercial art rather than experimental political art because of the market frameworks that exist in the art world now. And then further along, the US has always been um, present in different ways. One last example is the US definition of what cultural work is in like what nonprofits should do. And the pivot towards thinking of the cultural worker as an entrepreneur that is able to look at culture as a resource um, in the mid 2000s was completely supported by the US kind of like view on what culture should be. So the famous cultural golden years that Nicaragua enjoyed, like a cool music scene and music festivals and art festivals and everything, was done thanks to the professionalization of a cultural sector towards these administrative positions, rather than to allowing the autonomy of people to decide their own direction of what their artwork should take. And there's fascinating research on the cultural industry and how it's affected Latin America. And it's tied to the US and to surprisingly Spain, well, maybe unsurprisingly, Spain.
Um, Thank you. That's really helpful. I
Mhm.
did just get two great questions in the chat. I know we're um, coming up at 6:30, but we are able to stick around for a little bit longer. So please understand if you need to drop off and feel free to, but also we'll continue answering your questions in the meantime. So I have this question. Is there any space or safety for popular grassroots efforts to replicate the mural movement of the revolutionary period from 79 to 90? Is there an interest on the part of young people for such an effort? Yeah, maybe you can talk about your mural outside of Larisoma or some of the street art from 2018.
Yeah. So luckily, in the 80s, there was good efforts to actually archive all the murals that existed. So there's a couple great books promoted by the Institute of History that do a great way of preserving the fabulous work that was done through the murals. Um, Unfortunately, now, one of the kind of like biggest cases of censorship is that recently when Shanice Palacios won Miss Universe in Nicaragua um, in a couple years ago, it inspired a whole generation of people that just needed good news after several years of political crisis. And there's this case of these young artists that were painting a mural of Shanice, the winner, and they were both arrested. And they spent several months in prison just for doing a mural of Shanice, who won Miss Universe. So I would say to try to do that autonomously is impossible. You will be in jailed, and nobody is even trying to risk themselves doing that. Even if you go into the streets waving a Nicaraguan flag, you will be imprisoned. At the same time, the government already has its like muralist cultural front that is aestheticizing the entire public space to be a pro-government public space. So in terms of public murals, it's impossible. And that's why people went to social media, because the government right now doesn't control the aesthetics of what people share on social media, which is still dangerous. Um, but when there's no public space, people did revert to like the cyber world and flourish there. And there's been over 5 years of beautiful digital artwork that's being shared outside the grasp or censorship of the government. But it's still a very risky thing to do.
And I have one more question here. Um, is contemporary political art mostly focusing on creating new things as a sort of rebellion or rejection of traditional and nationalist art? Or is there a lot of art that attempts to reclaim classical nationalist images? And this audience member gives the example of El Gogüense, uh,
Mm.
and sort of asking about if that's happening in visual art as well, the sort of reappropriation of historical political figures.
Absolutely, 100% in 2018. That was one of the main strategies to look into Nicaraguan culture and our own myths and legends and our own grassroots national heroes and really monumentalize them in this politicized anti-government kind of way. Because 10 years prior to that, the government was intentionally privatizing any kind of narrative that people could have about these national heroes and myths. So, in the protests after 2018 and into this day, those images are now very much contested and can be used for both, for either side. I think political artists have tried to reclaim those. Um, the danger, though, is this embrace of nationalism, which it's very hard to critique nationalism in the protest art, but it's what people kind of like unified against. It was like a nationalist movement against the government. And what we had in common, students, farmers, indigenous people, mothers, is that we were all under this flag. So I still think we need to digest Nicaraguan nationalism, which is very Pacific centric, is very mestizo centric, is very lakes and volcano centric, and exclude so many different identities from all over Nicaragua. And we need to challenge that so that we don't have another reactionary nationalistic kind of like front that's using these same tools to enact what they want to do. So I would very much be wary of nationalism in like the protest art movement, but it's what people needed at the time.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. We're just past time, so um, I did drop in the chat. I wanted to mention that Gabriel has published a book recently called Antilogy, A Critical History of Contemporary Art in Nicaragua. So definitely encourage you all to check that out. Gabriel, can you let folks on the call know how to learn more about your work, or if you're open to it, how folks might be able to follow up with you? I see you starting to post things in the
Yeah. Sweet. Thank you. Thank you so much for giving me the space to really nerd out and kind of like share all these things that um I've spent a lot of time researching. And I could have gone, a whole book can be written about each specific period, and that's kind of like what I intend to focus on. Right now, if you want to reach out to me, you can reach out to me to Nepantra.arte, which is the art collective that I'm a part of. In our website, you will see all the artwork that we do. And on Instagram, unfortunately, is the best way to stay on track with everything that I'm doing here in Merida as a local organizer and artists. But I am totally open for any kind of further research or collaboration. Um, I'm going to start look for PhD programs here in Mexico to really find institutional support to keep doing this much needed research and everything. And I appreciate any kind of advice or coordinates or horizons that people might have to offer.
awesome. Well, thank you so much, Gabrielle. Thank you so much, Clask, for hosting us. And Yeah, we appreciate your time, and a recording will be available for any folks that missed out. And thank you all again for joining us.